Poison Spark Pathfinder is a great build. You can turn it into an uber boss killer, you can turn it into a speedy mapper, and you can use it for pretty much anything you want. And very few changes are needed to flex between different gameplay modes or playstyles. So it was one of my favorite builds from Crucible League, and now I've kind of gone through and revamped the PoB to include skill tattoos because there's a lot of bonuses to be found here. Maybe not so much when it comes to direct damage or defensive upgrades, but quite a lot when it comes to quality of life. Enough that I felt like it was worth making a Path of Exile 3.22 Poison Spark video going over some of the changes. If you want to know more about how the build functions at a baseline level or how I crafted my character during Crucible, I will link to both my original video and the Uber Boss version in the card and down in the description below. You can check it out after this. So let's start with key mechanics because they've changed quite a bit under the influence of tattoos, starting with how you get 100% uptime on all of your utility flasks. In the past, the way to do this was nodes on the tree like Careful Conservationist and mods on your belt, which greatly restricted your gearing. But now you can turn dexterity nodes into Tattoo of the Tefoa Herbalist, which gives you 6% increased flask effect duration. Stacking 5 or even 10 of these gives a significant amount of flask effect duration and can allow you to drop nodes on the tree, allow you to potentially use projectile clusters instead of flask clusters, or simply drop the belt mod. Your goal here is to combine all of these methods so that in PoB it shows 100% flask uptime. Not 100% uptime with like 80% minimum, but 100% uptime period. That's going to lead to the best gameplay experience and the most reliable uptime on your flasks, which is very important for capping your resistances. However, it should be noted, if you're using your tattoos in this way, you won't be able to use them for other quality of life effects like projectile speed, which also, by the way, comes from projectile nodes. So it's a little bit of a trade-off and kind of gets individualized to your own gear. And this segues nicely into the next topic as well. Poison Spark requires that you have 100% chance to poison, normally achieved through Divergent Herald of Agony, and that all of Spark's damage is converted from lightning over to chaos, which is done with Phantasmal Spark and Ashes of the Stars. And fitting all your auras usually requires a well-rolled Ashes of the Stars. But you can get reservation efficiency on your jewels, either as a corrupted implicit or as an explicit on normal jewels if you're using them. Furthermore, you can get reservation efficiency on a tattoo, replacing anything. So tattoos can be used here in place of a more expensive Ashes of the Stars. And if you're trying to do this on a budget, you can use Dialis Malefaction just to get the quality of your Phantasmal Spark up, but I do not recommend doing this because it taxes your defenses way too much. Next, let's quickly talk about Spark's own mechanics, because this is where I chose to put most of my tattoo investment. Spark is a projectile duration skill. You create a projectile that flies around for a duration and can hit an enemy once every 660 milliseconds. A base duration of 2 seconds means you can hit 3 times, but every 660 milliseconds that you add to the duration, accounting of course for server ticks, the more potential hits that you have. Spark projectiles can also bounce off of terrain and objects, so as long as they persist, small arenas mean the damage gets more focused, and in large arenas the damage is a bit less, it spreads out. However, even if it has remaining duration, when a spark projectile impacts with a mob, it will normally be absorbed. The way to prevent this is by adding Pierce. Personally, in my setup, I added 3 pierces via the tree using a node called Piercing Shots. This means that a given projectile can hit an enemy 4 times. 1 pierces, 2 pierces, 3 pierces, and on the 4th, it's absorbed. However, if you feel like 3 pierces really isn't enough, feel free to replace one of your flask cluster jewels with a projectile damage cluster jewel, and take the aerodynamics node. This gives an additional projectile pierce, some projectile damage that doesn't affect your build at all really, and some projectile speed which increases the quality of life. Again, this is kind of a trade-off on the tattoos. So ultimately, it does come down to personal taste, but I found the build felt totally fine as is. Last league, there weren't even skill tattoos, and it felt great. So you want to experiment here, but you don't need to do it. One thing you do need to do, however, is pay attention to your damage shifting. You can do this via Cloak of Flame and Taste of Hate, or alternatively, running Lightning Coil as opposed to Cloak of Flame. The big advantage of Cloak of Flame, you get 15% increased maximum life from a mastery because it has no life on it, and number 2, it has 130% increased resistances in comparison to Lightning Coil. The advantage of Lightning Coil, though, is you could potentially have evasion gear in your helmet, gloves, boots, and chest slot for 15% spell suppression from a mastery. I opted for the Cloak of Flame and Taste of Hate route, as I quite like that Cloak of Flame also applies to physical damage over time effects, and I didn't want to have to make up the 130% resistances. But with the additional flexibility offered by tattoos, I do think it can be done, it's just not the route I'd go. And speaking of, tattoos are also quite helpful when it comes to spell suppression. In the past, the build used Magebane to cap out Suppress, and it still uses Magebane because it still has a fair amount of dexterity. But unfortunately, a lot of your dexterity is now being converted over with tattoos. Therefore, you will want Tattoo of the Ramako Shaman for 2% chance to suppress spell damage until you're all the way to cap. If you're checking in-game rather than in PoB, remember that Revenge of a Hunted gives you 10% chance to suppress while on full life, so in-game you'll need to go 10% past when you hit 100, or if you're using PoB that simplifies it, I very much recommend doing this instead. This also allows you to leverage Ancestral Vision, which is a little bit cheaper than a Storm Shroud, to get 100% chance to avoid being shocked, chilled, ignited, frozen, brittle, sapped, or scorched. You get 50% from the Ancestral Vision itself, adding Elemental Avoidance to your spell suppression, and then you get the additional 50% from your boots by rolling them with Essence of Loathing. For recovery layers, this build uses a ton of them. First up, you should have a fairly permanent Life Flask effect while you're clearing maps. This is due to the Master Surgeon node. Next up, you get additional recovery from Blood Notch and Immutable Force. You're constantly going to be getting stunned due to the Energy Shield Mastery, where your stun threshold is based on 60% of your energy shield instead of life. I know this sounds bad, but don't worry. With Immutable Force, you'll never notice the stuns, and it allows you to use Blood Notch for a massive layer of recovery. And if that isn't enough, well, don't worry. Between Divergent Void Manipulation and Ethereal Feast, you'll be leeching both life and energy shield, and with the Leech Mastery, 10% of that's going to be instant. Maybe throw on a Vitality Watcher's Eye for even more recovery in the form of life gain on hit. Though you don't explicitly need the life gain on hit, I just happened to be able to pick up the Watcher's Eye in 3.21 and threw it into the build. Feels great, not mandatory because it can be quite expensive. And of course, instead of spending mana, the build spends Energy Shield via the Eldritch Battery Keystone. On a budget, you can get this via the Devouring Diadem Helmet, but it's also not that expensive to allocate, costing one additional passive since you path right by it for your second Cluster Jewel. Now, let's head over to PoB and start talking about the skills. So here we have Spark. Now, Phantasmal Spark converts 100% of lightning damage over to Chaos. For supports, I like Deadly Ailments. I think this is a pretty middle-of-the-road support. On one hand, it means you leech slightly less. On the other hand, because this build has leech, Life Flask recovery, and also recovery from things like Blood Notch, it doesn't necessarily need the leech. Oh, it has life gain on hit as well. But if you wanted to leech more, I would swap this out for another support. Similarly, Awakened Unbound Ailments adds a lot of damage for things like Uber bosses. And PoB will tell you, oh, it's a ton of DPS, but it's only a ton of DPS in certain situations, because the poison DPS right now is 280,000 per poison. If you're hitting a random mob in your map, then you're not really worrying about stacking a ton of poisons. Yes, this means that you stack up a bunch of poisons because your poisons last longer. You can see 1.4 million total and about 27 million. However, if you wanted your damage to feel better while mapping, you could drop Awaken Unbound Ailments and instead go with Swift Affliction. This seems to lower your damage hugely. Just cut the poison DPS in half. However, the poison DPS on an individual poison basis went to 349,000, which means you'd actually find your damage feels a lot better. This is one of the weird ways in which PoB lies to you, especially in regards to poison. So if you're fighting Uber bosses, I very much do advise Awakened Unbound Ailments. If you're just mapping, I suggest Awaken Swift Affliction instead. Now, if you wanted an alternative to Awaken Deadly Ailments, what you'd go with is Cruelty. As you can see, the hit size is much larger. Leech is much more effective, going up to 1.4k, up from 674. And if Blood Notch ever got nerfed, this is the kind of setup that I would advise for most content. Unfortunately, on Uber bosses, you're not necessarily going to hit hard enough to fully stack your Cruelty. So this would be more of a mapping setup, and then on the Uber bosses, you'd go back to Awaken Deadly Ailments. You'd lose a lot of value from your Leech, but you would instead gain a lot of that value back from the life gain on hit that you'd have to invest in at that point. So next up, auras. And this build has auras everywhere, which can be a little confusing. Having one set of auras together is very important, and everything else can go wherever you want. But you need Malevolence and Grace together with the Enlightened 4, and you want one of the 25% auras with them. Otherwise, you won't be able to make your reservations. Malevolence is used for damage, Grace is used because it's a great way to get some additional defenses, and Arctic Armor is used for the less physical and fire damage taken, especially with the divergent quality that is enhanced by Ashes of the Stars. You'll notice a theme on this build, which is alt quality gems are very effective and used quite often. Then for further auras, we've got Vitality. This is just at level 1 for the Watcher's Eye. If you don't have a Watcher's Eye with Vitality Leech or Vitality Life Gain on hit, you can drop this from the setup entirely. Herald of Agony is used to cap poison chance. You'll see the buff grants 70% chance to poison on hit, and this applies to spells as well as attacks. And last but not least, Anomalous Blood and Sand grants a significant amount of projectile speed. Just sit in sand stance and you're good to go. That's also why this is linked up to the Enhance. And then I have Portal here because having 222% cast speed feels really good. Then last up, the temporary aura of Val Haste. This is linked to Inspiration to further reduce the cost of the Divine Blessing. Haste feels really good while mapping, and Val Haste is a significant DPS boost because it allows you to stack your poisons faster. And then finally, a utility setup with Cast While Stunned. This is my lazy mapping setup. I wouldn't quite do this on Uber bosses, because on Uber bosses, you don't really want to get hit that much, so most likely you'd want to break the links here and use Withering Step and Blood Rage manually. But that's kind of a pain, and when I'm running around in a map, I don't need the extra damage from Withering Step, even though this is great because it fully withers an enemy. 12 debuffs, so let's just go into the configuration here. Set this to 0, 3.8 mil, set this back to 15, 9.1. Massive damage increase for automatically withering stuff. Just keep in mind that it's a trade-off between quality of life of having to cast it manually and also having to worry about eating charges for it with your Flame Dash because unfortunately they are mutually exclusive, or having it happen automatically but it might not be up on bosses. That's just a personal choice. I like going with a lazy route most of the time, and if I decide, hey, I'm going to do 12 Uber bosses, then I'll go with the a little more complicated method. For curses, the build is Dual Curse, and Despair and Temp Chains are both coming from the Asenaths. Now, passive skill tattoos are a feature new to PoE 3.22 Trial of the Ancestors, and they come exclusively from the Trial of the Ancestors mechanic. There are a few tattoos that I would consider to be best in slot on this build, the first of which is Loyalty Tattoo of Aowana. This triggers a spirit that increases the effect of your spell suppression, but you're limited to one loyalty tattoo. Because you have a 100% chance to suppress spell damage, when you take spell damage from a unique enemy, the spirit will trigger, increasing the effect of your suppression from the default 50 all the way up to a massive 70. So you'll feel pretty much invincible for the time that it's up. Then it goes on cooldown, and after a short cooldown, it'll come back. Now, overall, this felt really strong when I was experimenting with it on my other character, a Cold Out Elementalist. You'll see a little footage right now in Trial of the Ancestors. Now, the other best in slot option I found is Honor Tattoo of the Wise. +1 to level of Intelligence skill gems. This just gives you more damage on your Poison Spark, more effect on your auras. Overall, it's really good, and you take 1 Intelligence notable to facilitate it. Now, before I get into looking at tattoos on the skill tree, I wanted to call out one more powerful option. This one isn't best in slot, but it is very good and completely changes how you gear. The Journey Tattoo of the Makanui that would be used to overwrite Ghost Dance. This isn't in the game as of the time of releasing this video, and you'll use it to overwrite Ghost Dance with Elemental Overload. This way you don't need to use an Oscillating Scepter, and you don't need to worry about Elemental Overload on your weapon. But aside of that, the rest of the tattoos kind of depend on your individual gearing, how many attributes you have available, and personal choice. So let's get into a few of your options. As you can see, I've pretty much inked up my entire tree, getting rid of as many attributes as possible. First up, I'm using Honored Tattoo of the Oak to overwrite Strength nodes. This is just for more life, but you can use any of the Honored Tattoos, maybe override it with All Res, Reservation Efficiency, increased maximum resistances, Chaos Res, whatever you need. If it's a hole in your build, use it on Strength nodes that you no longer need. For Intelligence nodes, I tried to use as many Tattoo of a Valaka Warrior as I could. Adding 1 to 7 lightning damage is a 0.3% increase, and there's no real downside. Though if you needed something like lightning resistance, you could absolutely put that here instead. Where most of the choice comes in is on your dexterity nodes. There's a few that I'm using here, and a couple that I want to talk about. First up, Tattoo of the Ramako Shaman. You'll need to put several of these onto your tree to make up for the fact that you're losing effect on Magebane. Magebane still gives 11% suppress. I do think it's worth using Magebane just for that 11%. But it's a lot less effective than with the 300 dex that you had before tattoos. So keep in mind you'll need to make up the difference somewhere. Additionally, there's Tattoo of a Ramako Sniper for projectile speed. Projectile speed means your sparks fly around more actively and are very likely to hit enemies as a result. One of the changes that I made, switching to this higher quality of life setup, is the Chaos Mastery for when you inflict Wither. There's a chance to inflict up to 15 debuffs instead. That just feels really, really good when mapping. For bossing, I would still do this. Reason being, on bossing, you're going to be getting those 12 Wither debuffs immediately and up front from manually using Withering Step, so you don't need this. But when mapping, it feels good to have it automatically because you're not going to be hitting Withering Step too often. Or at least I don't, I just have it on the cast while stunned. Then, coming in here, another option would be chance to avoid being poisoned. If you stack a few of these, you'll be completely immune to poison. That feels really, really good. And Tattoo of the Tafoa Herbalist. This is what you do to get flask duration and either drop some flask nodes or change out your belt. Now, because my character was already set up to have 100% flask uptime, I didn't tattoo these on, but you very much could, and it kind of comes down to whether you want to use flask clusters or projectile clusters. Now, there is one more interesting tattoo I wanted to talk about. Tattoo of the Ramako Makanga. Skills fire an additional projectile if you have at least 7 adjacent passive skills allocated. Spark already fires a lot of projectiles, but if you wanted to make a hyperspeed mapping version, you'd want to pair that with something like projectile speed or maybe even movement speed from Ramako Fleetfoot to get as many projectiles as possible. The best way to do this is to socket it right around here and put the warrior's tail, which increases the effect of tattoos within radius. The warrior's tail hits a tattoo here for intelligence and a tattoo here for dexterity. It's really strong, but overall, because I wanted to play a more well-rounded version capable of mapping, bossing, and everything else, I did not want to invest further into projectiles. Normally, this is where I talk about the gear and how I crafted it, but in the case of this build, I actually crafted very little of the gear. I'm using a lot of unique items, a lot of corrupted items, and a lot of things that are a huge pain to craft and relatively easy to buy off of a live search. So I'll go into some of the stats that I'd recommend searching for a little bit more than about how to craft the items. There are some that are definitely craftable, I'm definitely going to talk about it. However, there's less crafting here than in most of my videos. That said, if you like crafting, stay tuned because I've got both a corruption-focused video and a crafting-focused video in the works, and I hope to have both done soon. Get subscribed so you don't miss them, and maybe leave a like while you're down there if you've been enjoying the video so far. So first up, one of the craftable items is your weapon. If you don't have the Journey Tattoo, you need to use an Oscillating Scepter for Elemental Overload. For this, you want plus to level of all lightning skill gems and lightning damage to spells. Achieve this by rolling Deafening Essence of Torment until you hit level of all lightning skill gems, and either an open prefix or a null until you have both an open prefix and an open suffix. From there, clean off any unneeded suffixes, and then do Prefixes Can't Be Changed, Ashling. If this adds a prefix, you either want it to be lightning damage and shock chance, or you want it to be chaos damage skill effect duration. If it's not one of those, always make sure to pick an attack tagged option like increased physical damage. If you pick an attack tagged option, you can craft Cannot Roll Caster and a null safely without taking off the spell tag lightning skill gems or lightning damage to spells. Eventually you will hit something that's either a useful prefix or a useful suffix. The prefixes are lightning damage, chaos damage. The useful suffixes are chaos.multi, or alternatively cast speed arcane surge. Once you hit that, multi-mod the item, fill in what else you need, and you're good to go. After you obtain the tattoo, you have two options. One would be to craft on a Tornado Wand base for lightning damage to spells and attacks, or even a Profane Wand base for cast speed. The other being to use a Void Scepter. Which one you choose among these all really comes down to price. In this case, I just grabbed a Fractured Damage Over Time Multiplier Void Scepter. Do not pay attention to the Elemental Overload here, that's just to simulate in PoE. This would be on your Ghost stance, not on the weapon. But between 40% increased elemental damage, lightning damage to spells, or cast speed, whatever you find is the best. The wands can roll projectile speed, which is good for quality of life. The scepter can roll something like crit strike chance for spells. And yes, you could even use a rune dagger if you got a good fracture on it, because crit chance isn't terrible. It makes your elemental overload uptime more stable. With how fast and frequently Spark hits, I didn't find elemental overload uptime to be a huge problem, but again, your mileage may vary there. The crafting method is very much the same. Get the isolated prefixes, then Ashling for something like Chaos Damage Over Time Multiplier. With a Fractured Damage Over Time Multiplier suffix, it's pretty easy. Just keep in mind that you could also get a Level of All Spell Skill Gem Prefix Fracture, Lightning Damage Prefix Fracture, Lightning Spell Skill Gem Prefix Fracture, damage over time multi-suffix fracture, cast speed suffix fracture, projectile speed suffix fracture if you want the quality of life, or even a chaos damage over time multiplier suffix fracture. The overall method is pretty similar. In some of those cases, you can even just skip the ashling step and go straight into multi-modding after you roll your prefixes or whatever else on the item. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about quickly was the Death Soul. You start with a 14% chance to suppress spell damage base. You roll it with Deafening Essence of Loathing for chance to avoid elemental ailments. This is to go with your Ancestral Vision. You'll need chance to avoid as a prefix. Your other prefix can be movement speed or action speed. I chose action speed for the damage. After your suffixes are good, be it strength, chaos resistance, a different resistance, whatever you need to fill in on your build, you use a Wild Bristle Matron for suffixes can't be changed, apply Veiled Chaos, block a mod as needed, and unveil. I happen to hit life here. You do not need life as a prefix. You can do crafted life. It's totally fine. Ideally, you might want something like Onslaught Hybrid or Move Speed if you haven't been hit recently. I just went with a first unveil because I hit the tier 1 life. For jewels, you want the damage over time multiplier while affected by Malevolence. That's very important. Life on hit while affected by Vitality, Leech while affected by Vitality, Spell Suppression while affected by Grace are all good options. Even Armor or Mitigation while affected by Determination is good, and then you swap Grace out for Determination. Go with whatever second mod you happen to get. To maximize your recovery, go for Immutable Force with, I would say, at least 700% increased stun recovery, and a Blood Notch. That way, whenever you're hit, you get stunned, and whenever you're stunned, you recover life. Brutal Restraint here is just to add Alchemist, Genius, and Onslaught. You can add Alchemist Genius via a medium cluster jewel if you need, and you can add Onslaught via boots. So this is fully replaceable, but it does add a lot of dex, which means you can wear more tattoos. On this jewel, I happen to have the 5% chance to poison that I need to cap things out, and then damaging ailments deal 4% faster, some life, poison duration, and dot multi. But you can get that chance to poison elsewhere, and if you do, maybe pick it up on a small passive on your tree, something like right here, then you don't need the jewel to have chance to poison on hit. Impossible Escape cannot be socketed in a cluster jewel. You want in radius of Chaos Inoculation, so that way you don't have to anoint Whispers of Doom. This opens up the much cheaper Steeped in the Profane, while also letting you take a lot of really good damaging nodes. And the reason it's important to never put this in a cluster is cluster jewels disable radius effects, which this has. For clusters, on larges, go with Dark Ideation, Unholy Grace, Unwaveringly Evil on 8 passive chaos clusters. Then, for your medium clusters, you have several options. If you just want damage, you can get chaos damage over time, with things like Circling Oblivion and Wicked Pall. Maybe you want Flow of Life instead for a little bit of extra life. If your flasks do not already have 100% uptime, and you think you need extra uptime on your life flask, you can go with a flask effect duration, and gain really nice bonuses such as Peak Vigor for increased life recovery from flask. Personally, I would always run at least one medium flask cluster, but alternatively, you could go with Proj clusters as well. You'll want Aerodynamics for +1 Pierce on your Spark. You want to pair this with either Streamlined for additional projectile speed. Note, I know this says projectile damage that applies to your hits, not to your poisons, so it won't actually be a DPS increase, it's pure quality of life. Or alternatively, Repeater. Again, the projectile damage does not apply, but the 8% cast speed does, which is a small DPS up. Now last up, for rings, there's a couple ways to go about it. One of which is to essence craft unfractured suffixes. This can be something like cast speed, chaos res, or strength. Alternatively, you can just live search rings and slam them, which is what I did here. I live searched until I got chaos resistance, damage taken recouped of its life, and cast speed. 3 suffixes that I wanted. Then I did Wild Bristle Matron for suffixes that can't be changed, Veiled Chaos until I got life. Now I have the Hybrid Life Mana Regen mod. And then I slammed it with a Crusader's Exalt until I got the life gained for enemies hit by your spells, and crafted on the minus mana cost. Getting a ring like this is a long, often frustrating, and often arduous process, so I do not particularly advise doing it. Instead, I just go with rings that are pretty good from ROG, either crafted on a fractured base, or buy something with good suffixes, put life on a prefix, and call it finished. I'll give an example of this in just a second here. And for now, let's go in game and look at some of the other alternatives. This ring is a perfect example of what I mean by something that's good enough. I found the Chaos Resistance, damage taken recouped, cast speed, something like that is very easy to generate with ROG. Then I added the life, and then I slammed it and happened to hit maximum energy shield. Max yes is good quality of life, but not strictly required. So you could do without that, and the ring would be totally usable. I've also got several uniques. Etzer's Reflection is effectively curse immunity, and increased effective curses greatly adds to your damage. Plus, grab the intelligence to be able to tattoo more of it away. Having a higher maximum energy shield and evasion rating is also nice quality of life, as is the elemental resistances, but those things aren't required because you can solve it with tattoos. Ashes of the Stars, I'd consider this to be best in slot for the build. You need the plus 30% to quality of all skill gems. The increased reservation efficiency of skills varies based on the rest of your gear. I used 17% because I got the remaining 2% from a jewel. You can also get 1% per tattoo, and you can get 2% per corrupted implicit. It's also available as an explicit on several jewel modifiers. I'm using Asenath's Gentle Touch for dual curse, and I've got one corrupted with cast speed. If instead you wanted something a little different, you could go Hands of a High Templar. You'll lose the Explodey effect. That's totally fine if you're primarily doing bossing. And what you'd gain is either Temporal Chains plus Despair as 2 implicits with cast speed, and slightly more stats on your gloves, or alternatively you could only get one of those curses on hit, and you end up going with the other one via a self-cast, maybe a Balance of Terror for a few extra defenses. But I like the combination of the Explodey effect and the passive Pathfinder clear. Furthermore, I've got Cloak of Flame here with +2 duration and +2 projectile. You don't need the +4 gems. +1, +2 would also work, and overall my Spark probably has too many levels on gems already. It's beyond the point where the damage is super meaningful. The important thing is to get the 75% fire rest to help you cap, and that you're using a Cloak of Flame for the 40% of fizz taken as fire. Now I did craft my helmet. I bought the Fractured Hubris Circlet base, and then rolled it with Essence of Loathing. That's what the 10% mana reservation efficiency is from. You can use a Devouring Diadem as a budget option. For prefixes, cast speed and fizz taken as lightning. I happen to get absolutely nutty prefixes here, which is why I ended up with the open suffix that I used to fill in suppress. But that's not how the POB is set up, because I don't think it's a particularly realistic expectation. Instead, you'd want to spam until you hit 3 good suffixes, and then do the Wild Bristle Matron, get any relevant prefix off of your Veiled Chaos, and craft 70 life, call it good. Or maybe you hit life and craft DS and call it good. For fractures, I'd go with either fizz from hits is taken as cold, or fizz from hits is taken as lightning. That way you get the maximum value out of it due to your flasks reducing the damage you take from both of those types. Fire's fine, and chaos is fine, they're just not mitigated quite as much. And then, finally, the belt. I suggest live searching this. You want at least 2 flask mods, though as a note, that 23% increased flask effect duration is also 4 tattoos. So you could drop that mod entirely and just get the 20% or so reduced flask charges used and call it good. That means I generally have no issues with my mana. Flask life recovery rate is a good prefix. You want life as a prefix, and you can Hunter Slam it for either chaos damage or max life. Both are very frequently rolled. Something like what I just described is quite difficult to roll for yourself, but fairly easy to pick up on a live search, especially if you don't need the double flask suffix. And for flasks, I'm using a life flask of antitoxin. Again, you could solve poison via tattoos. Do get the 70% increased amount recovered. Don't worry that it's over 3 seconds. You have plenty of other recovery rate effects to get the massive healing per second. Quicksilver Flask of the Order for reduced mana cost of skills. This is how we can spam skills so freely. It's very important to the build. I like the reduced charges used here, because consuming 21 makes it much easier to get 100% uptime. Again, check your flask uptime in POB, make sure it's 100%. My last 3 flasks are defensive. Number 1, Taste of Hate. This is a legacy version that has over the 15% of fizz taken as hits. That's just because when I was reassembling the character in Standard, I couldn't find the exact right one. It should go up to 15, try to get a 15%. The fizz is extra cold, doesn't matter here. You can also use a Topaz Flask with additional elemental resistances. I suggest the Alchemist's Prefix, reduced duration, increased effect. Try to get the highest tier possible on this for the lowest duration reduction. That way you not only have more resistances, but you maintain perfect uptime. And last but not least, Progenesis. Reduced charges per use is great, increased duration is great, doesn't necessarily have to be quite as well rolled. Again, just check in POB and use tattoos as you need to make sure it has 100% uptime. Now, when it comes to the gameplay for Poison Spark Pathfinder, there's a few things to think about. First up, are you going to be primarily mapping or primarily bossing? If you're primarily mapping, then I'd definitely suggest focusing on poison deals damage faster and the highest poison DPS per poison, because you're not going to have the time to stack a bunch of poisons on enemies. This is also where something like Azanath's is super important for the Explodey effect. Furthermore, instead of getting things like projectile speed, you could invest in stats like movement speed to clear your legions faster or just run around your map picking up loot. On the other hand, if you're taking on uber bosses, long poisons get to stack up, and you're not going to be hitting hard enough to enable an effect like Cruelty. In this case, PoB's DPS is much more accurate, but it also means that you'll want to take certain things off of cast while stunned, because to get stunned, you need to get hit, and if you're getting hit, there's a very good chance that you'll die on uber bosses. If you wanted to make an uber boss focused version of this build, I'd unlock Lethshade, possibly by pathing over to it, or possibly by using it instead of Elemental Overload and just using an Elemental Overload Scepter. In this case, I'm a little less worried about my damage per poison and more worried about my ability to stack it up. Therefore, things like projectile speed, cast speed, and pierce become more valuable. When fighting phased bosses, always remember to precast. It's free DPS, they're just standing there doing their evil roleplay, and you might as well punish them for it. Oftentimes you can inflict so much damage that you pretty much instantly kill them when the roleplay ends. When it comes to tattoos, one thing I really like about this build is it's kind of opened up a wide range of personal customization for people playing it. You can go into projectile speed, you can go into maximum life, you can get resistances, even more than you already had, or you could go Flask Effect Duration and put on a Headhunter. Because yes, on a mapping-focused version of a build, that's a totally viable option as well, and I think with a Headhunter this build would be literally immortal, at least while doing 100% delirious mapping. Now personally, when I played it in Crucible, I went for the well-rounded approach, being able to do a little bit of everything. So I jumped into the Delve and farmed several Delve bosses. I was able to pretty much face tank anything they did due to Blood Notch. It got even better after I added the life gain on hit instead of just a Leech Vitality Watcher's Eye. In terms of mapping, my clear speed was lightning fast, at least fast for me, about a couple minutes per tier 16 map. I was able to click and ignore almost all the altar mods. Plus I was full clearing legions, easily doing blights, never had to build a tower if I didn't want to, and blowing up breaches like nobody's business. In terms of very packed locations such as Legion and Breach, this build absolutely excels, because a tanky enemy will often spawn around a bunch of trash mobs, and then those trash mobs die, exploding and putting poisons on the boss. Also, when they die, they spread their own poisons, the strongest poison on the enemy, to the boss, stacking up a ton of poisons, making it super efficient. And if you want to know more about the exact setup that I use, maybe check out a POB, that'll be in my Discord. Be sure to follow the link down in the description. Then, once you get there, react to the post to give yourself both the community and notification role. Once you do, head down to the Build Link archive channel where you'll find the POB. It's going to be labeled Poison Spark Pathfinder 3.22 tattoo version or something similar to that. And checking the Build Link archive is the best way to stay up to date with all of my builds, POBs, passive trees, etc. But when it comes to this build, I will give one word of warning. This is not the sort of build that feels good when you cut corners. Yes, you can use a Diala's Malefaction instead of an Ashes of the Stars, but doing so significantly taxes your defenses and means you need to solve physical mitigation via a different means. Yes, you can get away with a more basic weapon dropping Elemental Overload. That's a significant damage loss. Yes, you can just allocate Whispers of Doom without using the Impossible Escape, but again, that costs you significant damage, defense, or quality of life elsewhere. I would not advise going into this looking to spend the bare minimum. I would advise going into this when you say, cost isn't an issue, I want a really awesome build. And if you want a handy reference on how I set the build up, then do be sure to head over to MaxwellGG and read all about it. Or if you're looking for some alternative perspectives, maybe check on PoE Ninja and see what other people playing the build are doing in 3.22. With that said, I'm curious, how do you feel about poison builds in Path of Exile? Do you find that the ramp up is painful, or do you think that things die fast enough as it is? I know some people say, oh, I don't play dot builds because the ramp up annoys me. And other people say, oh, dot builds, they're my life, because I know I always get the damage I need with relatively minimal investment in comparison to a lot of hit builds. But if you have any strong thoughts on poison builds, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out the Crucible version and min-maxed Crucible version of this build, or some of the mechanics that I've talked about previously. I'll link to all of those resources up in the card and down below. Before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to that is down in the description. With that said, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at Poison Spark Pathfinder, maybe learned something about the build or its unique mechanics, and I'll see you again sometime soon.